Let's see if we can make some sense of the opening 18 lines to the general prologue. Now, if we think of the general prologue as a whole, it has a certain structure to it. So we have a bunch of opening lines. Then we get the description of these different pilgrims who go on this pilgrimage. There are 29 pilgrims, plus, of course, the host, the innkeeper, and the narrator. So we'll call this Chaucer, and that makes for 31. And all of them are going to go on this pilgrimage. And on the way to Canterbury and on the way back, they're going to tell stories. They make this agreement, and then the knight is the one who starts. So the knight's tale comes first after the general prologue. That's basically the structure of the general prologue. But before we get to the actual portraits, we have this lovely description of springtime, which makes everybody want to travel. And what's remarkable about this description is that it's all one sentence. So you could say that it's a kind of showpiece. Chaucer's really showing off what he can do here. And you might compare this to how in a medieval manuscript, sometimes you have this initial, this illuminated initial, and that's kind of what these opening 18 lines are like. Now, they do have their own structure. So as you look at this, it starts with when or wan. Then we have another when over here. We have an and further down we have a dhanna. So the idea here is that when this happens, and when this happens, and when this happens, then something else happens. And that something else is that these pilgrims want to go traveling. When it's springtime, everybody gets this sudden urge to get out, right? To see places. You might compare this to the wind in the willows, where the mole is cleaning up his house in the springtime, and then he's like, forget it, I'm out of here, I'm going to explore the world. So that's basically the structure of these opening lines, and if you have to memorize these, some instructors are cruel and make their students memorize Chaucer. I do that. If that's the case, then this structure will really help you to make sense of these lines, so you can kind of memorize them in batches here. So we start then with this first when, one that April with his sure soul to the drucht of March hath perse to the rota. And if we're talking about a time here, a lot of scholars date this to 1387 for various reasons. That's when the fictional pilgrimage takes place, but of course Chaucer is writing these stories well into the 1390s, and by the time he passes away in 1400, he's not really finished with the Canterbury Tales. So this gives us a bit of a time frame then, and the month of April is associated here with a lot of rain. One that April with his sure sote, with its showers sweet. Sote means sweet. And notice the long O here in Middle English. You kind of have to pronounce that a little bit different, right? Sote. April still today sometimes is associated with showers. We have this expression, April showers bring May flowers. So the pronoun here is his, and his is a bit tricky. In Middle English, some of the pronouns are fairly straightforward and others can be confusing. So his can mean his, but it can also mean its. And in this case, it should just be translated as its. There is no gender for April here. One that April, when that April with its sweet showers has pierced the drought of March to the root. In other words, March has been very dry, and now the drought of March is over because April with its showers is going right down to the roots of the plants. By the way, as you read on here, you're going to see all the four elements, which are critical to medieval worldview, in action. So we start with water, of course, water and earth. The parched earth is coming alive, and we're going to get the other elements here as well. So we're going to get, let me see here, air with Zephyrus. So there's air. And then later with the sun, the Junge Sonne, that would be fire, you could say. So some critics have read the four different elements into this passage. If we go back to line 3, we read, "And bathed every vine and switch liquor, which vertu engendret is the floor." So April, who is still the subject here, is bathing every vein of every plant in such liquid, which is such, that by this power, vertu can mean virtue in our modern sense, but quite often it actually just means power, vigor, energy, force, right? And so the idea here is that by the power or the properties of the water, the flower is procreated or begotten, you could say. And to engender means to beget or to have offspring. So by the power of the liquid, which is in every vein of every plant, and a vein here is a sap vessel. So by this power, the flower is brought forth, you could say. All right, so lovely description here of what the water does and how it creates life. A little bit later in these opening 18 lines, there's going to be a reference to nature. And nature in the Middle Ages is often personified. And sometimes in the Middle Ages, there's this distinction between two aspects of nature. There is natura naturata, which is nature created, you might say, nature natured. And then we also have natura naturans, which is nature creating. And we see both of these things in this passage. God created nature, natura naturata, but nature is also constantly refreshing itself, regenerating itself. There's new life. There's this active force in nature. And that would be natura naturans. So we see that also then with the following series of lines where we see Zephyrus, the west wind, acting with its sweet breath. One Zephyrus eke means also Middle English, and you'll want to watch out for this word because it comes up all the time. One Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath, in spirit hath in every holt and heath the tender croppus. So Zephyrus, the mild west wind in the spring, is breathing into everything, in every holt and heath. Holt here means every wood. So holt is a wood or a grove, and heath is a field, but it's particularly an uncultivated field, an untilled field. It's often associated with wilderness and barren fields as well. So, of course, we can take this in any sense. It can be a field that is then sown by the farmer. But when we think of these crops, we should not just think of farmers' crops, I think. We should think much more broadly because these plants are growing everywhere in nature. Notice the his again here as we had before with his shura sota. And then in spirit means breathe into, if we go back to the Latin. And the word inspiration in the Middle Ages is often associated with the Holy Spirit. So if we think of the divine aspect here as well, the west wind is like the Holy Spirit in breathing life into things, in this case with its warm air, which produces growth. So you could say that even though God is not mentioned really in these opening lines, nature nevertheless is being linked to something more divine in a sort of subtle way here, you could say. And some people also point to the junge Sonne as a sort of potential play on words that make us think about the sun, Jesus Christ, and not just the sun in the sky. But these plays on words are very subtle. You don't notice them immediately, and you can easily read this as just a beautiful description of nature. So we get then to the description of the sun, and it says, the junge Sonne hath in the ram his halfkoers I ronne. Now this reference here is to Aries. So Aries is one of the signs of the zodiac, and I'll just draw a kind of simplified version of this star constellation. There you go. It'll have to look like a ram, I guess. And in the Middle Ages, they put a lot of emphasis on the importance of the zodiac, and they pointed out that there are 12 signs of the zodiac, and they are visible at different times of the year. So some are more visible than others at different times, and there's a sort of order to them. So we have Pisces, comes up a little bit earlier, and then Aries, then Taurus, the bull. And Each of these is associated with a time of the year. So Aries is particularly associated with roughly from March 12 to April 11, kind of a 30-day stretch there. Oops, April 11. There we go. And the way you should think about this is that in the medieval understanding of the universe, if you are on Earth, right, and you're looking up in the night sky, well, this is not at night, but the sun is, of course, also there. So there we go. And the backdrop of the stars is behind the sun. So you can imagine that the sun is making this sort of circle in the sky as it's going around, right? Here you are on Earth, and the sun appears to be moving. This is the Ptolemaic universe, where the Earth is stationary. The sun appears to be moving through the sky, and it goes through different constellations because the stars don't seem to change that much. They're much further away. So it's like the sun is making this movement, and we call this the ecliptic. And that hopefully helps you make some sense of this notion that the sun is running its course through the sign of the Ram at a certain time of the year. Now, this verb here, irona, it has the Y and then the verb. That's typically in Middle English a sign of the past participle. So this means has run its half course in the sign of the Ram. Not all the time are we going to see this Y for the past participle. So at the end of the 18 lines, we have this reference to holpen, and in this case, holpen is also a past participle, but it doesn't have the Y. Okay, we're getting kind of sidetracked here. Now, one of the interesting things about this line is that it has led to a lot of critical dispute and a lot of scholarship, because, as you can see, it talks about the half course of the sun through the sign of the Ram. But if we have this period, March 12 to April 11, halfway through would be about March 27, and of course that would not be in April. So how can we make sense of this? What does this actually mean? Well, I'm not going to get into this too much. You can read up the scholarship yourself, but critics are agreed more or less that this story should take place then sometime after April 11. And a lot of scholars date this to roughly April 16 to 17 because of other references elsewhere in the Canterbury Tales. And so if you want to understand this more, how they deal with this discrepancy, you're going to have to read additional articles. I don't have time to get into this right now. But what is significant here, I think, is that the ram as a symbol signifies new beginnings. It signifies spring. And it also stands in contrast to a different sign in the Canterbury Tales. So if you go to the Parson's Prologue at the very end of the Canterbury Tales, the parson tells the very last story. The parson refers to Libra, which is the scales, and the scales make us think about judgment, right? Final judgment. The Canterbury Tales then are sort of between these two signs, spring and new beginnings and life and so on. And then we also have the final judgment. So it says, the jonge sonne hath in the ram his half course ironna, and smale voeles maken melodie, that slepen al de nicht with open ear, so pricketh hem natuur in her courages. Such beautiful lines. We have these lovely little birds making melodies, it's springtime, that sleep all the night with open eyes. Now, this is a bit of an ironic line, isn't it? Because how can you sleep with open eyes? But these birds are so full of love. They want to procreate. They're singing. It's springtime. And they're not really sleeping in that sense. They are active. This line always reminds me of another poetic line from Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, which is a much later poem. He's talking about these aristocratic lovers who are pretending to be lovers. They're very affected. And the line goes, and sleepless lovers just at 12 awake. So in that case, they pretend to be lovers. They can't sleep, but they actually sleep until noon and have no trouble doing so. In any case, as we read this, Chaucer adds another line, so pricketh hem naturen hier courageous. Here's the explanation for why they are sleeping with open eyes. Nature is pricking them in their hearts. Courageous comes from French, cœur, right? And there's lots of French words in these opening lines, and actually that's what makes this so beautiful, this mixing of Old English and French to create this new language, which Chaucer would have been very aware of as he was writing this, and we have to rediscover this. But as we read this, we have a couple of confusing pronouns here. So the way to translate this is them and their. So nature pricks them, the birds, in their hearts. What's happening in Chaucer's time is that the pronouns are shifting. Chaucer does tend to use they as the nominative or subject case, but in the other cases he often uses older forms, Old English forms like hem and here, whereas the more modern forms, which are coming in from Old Norse, from the north actually, all these Scandinavian settlements, they are gradually creeping in, and Chaucer hasn't quite caught on to some of these things yet. So we have this mixture of pronouns in Chaucer. And this reads, so pricketh them, hem, natur, in their hearts. By the way, the pronunciation of nature can also change in Chaucer because of the emphasis. It can be very tricky to know how to pronounce this, and there's definitely leeway in terms of how you want to do this. A few general comments about these opening lines then. What we see is a beautiful reflection on nature, but then suddenly in the next line it's going to shift by focusing on pilgrimage. And Chaucer really does this on purpose. He wants to create this contrast. As the critic Helen Cooper has pointed out, this rhyme is quite startling, courageous, pilgrimages, because the courageous refers to the sexual urges that the birds have, and then suddenly people have these urges to go on pilgrimages. A spiritual kind of pursuit. How do we bring these different perspectives together, right? Now, some of the pilgrims, it turns out, are mostly going on a holiday. They're not really there to pay their respects to the saint quite as much, but others are interested in spirituality. And I would say that for Chaucer, he's not ultimately a radical dualist. He's not a Gnostic or a Cathar, if it was a medieval perspective. He wants to bring these perspectives together, the physical and the spiritual, and yet he's also very aware that it leads to difficulties as well, that many of the characters in his story are going to struggle with finding the balance between these two perspectives. All right, so dan a longen folk te gaan on pilgrimages en palmeres voor te seken strange strondes. So these people, these folk, they go on pilgrimages. Palmers here is another word for a pilgrim, and a palmer was somebody who went to the Holy Land and took back a palm leaf as a symbol of this pilgrimage. Other popular pilgrimage sites were Rome and Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. And so you can see that this is a technical term for one kind of pilgrim, but over time the word becomes generalized as well. Strange here, this is a word from French. Strange here has the sense of foreign, exotic, remote, you might say. Maybe another translation would be unfamiliar. And the word strand has mostly disappeared from English. You do find it in modern Dutch. So in Dutch, strand means beach, and you can translate this as shore or beach. So palmers are seeking foreign shores. Te ferne halves kuth en sondri landes. Ferne here, another word that has kind of disappeared, means far away, and halves has the sense of shrines. So these are hallowed places. Think of the Lord's Prayer, hallowed be thy name, right? So halves can refer to shrines or even the saints associated with them. And these pilgrims are traveling to these faraway holy places, known kuth in sondri landes, in various lands. Today we still have this expression, all and sundry, all and sundry. Basically everybody, right? Although when I mention this to students, a lot of them are like, I've never heard of this expression. So maybe it also is disappearing from the English language. So palmers are traveling to faraway shrines known in various lands. And then we get to the final number of lines. And specially from every Shires ende of Engeland to Canterbury they wende. So wende here is actually the present tense. This means to go or to travel. It's not a verb that we use in this sense today. And the Shire is a district. Think of like Lord of the Rings, right? The Shire. So they come from every end of, or from every shire's end of England. They travel to Canterbury. One of the things to notice here with pronunciation is that ende ends with an E, and normally if the next word starts with a vowel, then you drop the final E. But at the end of a line, it's tricky because, of course, even though of starts with a vowel, you want ende to rhyme with wende. And here we don't drop the final E, so I would pronounce this or maybe run it into the next line a little bit. And especially from every Shires end of Engeland to Canterbury they wende. That brings us then to the final two lines. The holy blissful martyr for te seke, that hemmeth holpen wanneer die were seke. Now, the holy blissful martyr here is Thomas Becket, and I'll talk about him more in a moment. But he's described as holy and blissful has the sense of blessed, blessed. You could say full of the bliss of heaven. And these pilgrims are seeking his shrine. So they're going to his shrine. And the reason is given in the last line, that hemmeth holpen wanneer die were seke. So here's him again, right? Them. He, Thomas Becket, has helped them when they were sick. Now this is a different understanding then of seke. It doesn't mean to seek, it means to be sick. Maybe in the winter time they were sick. They prayed to Thomas Becket to intercede for them. They were healed. And then they thought, you know what, I need to pay my respects and go to Thomas Becket's shrine to show my thankfulness. You might notice, though, that these final two words aren't really all that much of a rhyme. Seke and seke, they sound pretty much the same. But in Middle English, this is actually a sort of a noble rhyme. It's a rhyme that is intended to make us reflect on the meaning of these words. It startles us, it makes us go, oh, does that rhyme? And then we start thinking about these words. Another medieval poet who does this a lot is John Gower, Chaucer's contemporary. And if we think about these things, we reflect, well, sickness is part of this life, right? We started with creation, but there's also the fall. And in this fallen world, there is sickness, there's pestilence, there's plague, as people very well knew in the 14th century. And in that kind of situation, with that kind of life, what are we seeking in this life? Are we seeking the divine? Are we seeking our own pleasures? These are things that we need to reflect on. So this verb seeking at the end is very powerful, and it makes us think about pilgrimage in a more general sense. Are we on a pilgrimage to something else? Right? It's a very medieval perspective here. All right, let me finish with just a few quick observations about Thomas Becket, so you know who this saint is. He actually died a couple of centuries earlier. He passed away in 1170, December 29. I said passed away, but really he was murdered. And his murder happened because he came into conflict with King Henry II. Initially, they seemed to be allies, but then they had a falling out. Their dispute was over whether clergy should be tried in the secular courts. And Thomas Becket, who was the archbishop, he said no, right? You cannot take away the power of the church in this way. Henry II was very upset by this. There's this famous line associated with him, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Although this line is likely from a later dramatization. It's not quite what he said. But he did refer to Thomas Becket as a low-born clerk, and he questioned the courage of his followers in dealing with Thomas Becket. Well, if you are a ruler, you have to be careful in what you say to your followers, because 4 of Henry II's knights took him up on his word. They went to the cathedral in Canterbury and they murdered Thomas Becket. Becket then was canonized just a few years later in 1173, and his shrine became one of the most popular and wealthiest in all of Europe. Interestingly, during the Reformation, his reputation went downhill, and that's because he was seen as a supporter of Rome against the English king, and the Anglican Church, of course, tried to separate itself from Rome. And one final quick note, in the 20th century, T.S. Eliot wrote a play about this called Murder in the Cathedral. So that is the historical background here, and now we can see how after these beautiful opening 18 lines, Chaucer has set things up to start describing the Pilgrims and to introduce us to everybody who is traveling for various reasons, whether for religious purposes or for love or maybe for something else.